Investment advice, AI, gender, and sexuality. The Buddha presented the Eightfold Path roughly 2,500 years ago. Can it have anything relevant to say to all that? Well, if I took the time to record this, my answer must be yes. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. The middle way, 4 sights, an eightfold path, 4 truths, 3 layers of knowing the 4 truths, 6 senses, 5 bundles, 3 poisons, and their 3 opposites. The past several episodes have introduced us to all of those, and we've barely scratched the surface of the Buddha's teaching. In the last episode, we began the process of looking in more detail at 2 of the elements of the Eightfold Path within a division of those called the wisdom category. The third of those categories is meditation, and in between is the focus for this episode, morality. The 2 elements in the wisdom basket, right view and right resolve, are referred to as wisdom in part because they are the foundational wisdom needed to sustain us throughout the journey on the Eightfold Path. Thus, right view needs to be applied to the other 7 rights: right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the same is true of right resolve. It is to be applied consistently and repeatedly to right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and also to the first of the 8 elements, right view. We also noted that right resolve highlighted the need to eliminate the root poisons of craving, anger, and illusion, and to replace them with their opposites. Replace craving with equanimity and acceptance. Replace anger or bitterness with compassion and empathy. Replace illusion or delusion with knowing and seeing everything as it really is. And now we turn to the next basket, morality, which includes 3 elements: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. In each case, we will look at what the 3 elements mean, and then along the way, at various points, we will note how right view and right resolve affect the way we approach these topics of speech, action, and earning our livelihood. So first, right speech. In the first of the Buddha's discourses, which has been the focus in these episodes, he simply states what the 8 elements of the path are. In other suttas, however, relative to right speech, the Buddha explained in more detail, saying, "And what is right speech? Abstaining from lying, from divisive speech, from abusive speech, and from idle chatter. This is called right speech." Now, as we begin, it's really important to remember that the Buddha's primary audience for his teaching was people who have elected to leave the norms of daily household life, become part of his sangha. They're monks, they are bhikkhus. And for monks, the Buddha's guidance about each of the 4 components of right speech includes specific details for the monks that we do need to take note of, before then looking at how his teaching might apply in so-called normal life. And I'll do that throughout right action. The instructions for monks and then the instructions for the rest of us. In some ways, right speech for monks could be summarized this way. It's just talk about the Dhamma and nothing else. He said, for example, at one point, there are these 10 topics of proper conversation, meaning for monks. Which 10? Talking about modesty, contentment, seclusion, non-entanglement, arousing persistence, virtue, concentration, discernment, release, and the knowledge and vision of release. But what about non-monks? We talk casually among ourselves, and from necessity as well, about a lot of other topics than those that he just listed. So what is right speech for you and I? It helps me to try to be specific about how to apply this sort of thing, to pick some area to focus on. And it seems to me very timely to be talking about right speech in the age of social media. It's in many ways a sort of mass, quasi-anonymous, communal living example full of the four things the Buddha saw as wrong speech. Social media is literally ablaze with lying, falsehoods, fake news, the spin of influencers, AI slop that is total fabrication intended to portray real events, division, polarizing hate speech, us versus them, posts intended to further stereotypes of the kind of people we already know we hate, F them, F that, abuse, rage bait, actual attacks on specific people, bullying, politicians using personal and official social media as platforms for attacking their critics, dismissing others with name-calling and offensive labels, and the more subtle forms of abuse in social media in which a reel might play on our insecurities, insinuating that this or that person or product is going to fill the gap in our inadequacy by first confirming our inner sense that we are in fact inadequate. That's abuse. Idle chatter, clickbait intended to magnetize our attention to meaningless memes, pairing trending music with a pointless post simply to increase views, likes, and follows. Well, in another discourse, the Samannaphala Sutta, the sutta called the Fruit of Contemplative Life, the Buddha pairs each of the four examples of wrong speech with their positive mirror images, similar to what we saw in his approach to replacing the three poisons with positive opposites. And so what if we applied that to social media? Imagine if our personal approach to social media were marked by right speech in the form of a daily intention and practice to, for example, abstain from false speech and replace it with speaking the truth, holding to the truth, firm, reliable, with no deceit, to use words from the Buddha. Abstain from divisive speech and replace that with creating unity, concord, peace among others. Abstain from abusive speech and replace that with speaking with affection, politeness, in ways that are pleasing to the other. Abstain from idle chatter and replace that with speaking what is connected with wisdom, what serves the good of others, what encourages us to grow as human beings. And since much of social media includes memes intended to be humorous, and since I'm not opposed to laughter, how might we replace empty and sometimes cruel humor in social media with humor aimed to heal with joy, not to ridicule and to bully? Now, implicit in all of this is the need to apply right view and right resolve to the pursuit of right speech. We need the right view of whether we're causing suffering through our speech, whether we're inciting in ourselves or others more of the craving that leads to suffering and attachment, whether we're speaking in ways that only deepen the fetters caused by views that are a result of what we noted as the five aggregates in prior episodes, the bundles of ideas and views that simply trap us in illusion and delusion, whether we're encouraging or hindering progress towards the cessation of suffering and its causes for ourselves or others. Right resolve encourages an honest appraisal of our intentions and the motivations behind what we choose to say and not say in social media and when we choose to say it. And the same goes on for what we choose to consume, follow, like, repost. I think this is a good time to point out that the Buddha also taught that right speech at times requires that we say things that are beneficial, but which are not pleasing to the other person. Right speech might be difficult for another person to hear, might even lead to accusations from them that we're in fact engaged in one of the types of wrong speech he outlines, accusations that we're being abusive, divisive, lying. In the face of such responses, it's easy to then become defensive and to justify ourselves and to engage in wrong speech. So right resolve would encourage us to evaluate our motives even when saying beneficial things, and our motives in how we respond to the feedback of others. I'm sure we all know times when we have said the right things for the wrong reasons, offering an otherwise correct observation, but finding a perverse pleasure perhaps in the pain it might cause, or perhaps in the way it makes us feel better about ourselves, etc. And there's times when we react defensively in the moment and then come to regret it later. Many Buddhist practices, as we will see when we proceed to other elements of the path included in the meditation basket, foster a very exacting process of right view and right resolve in terms of self-awareness, an increasing ability to notice the most subtle self-deceptions corrected through the rigorous application of right view sometimes, and mixed motivations corrected through the rigorous cultivation of various dimensions of right resolve. Now, there's a lot more to say about right speech, but that should give us sort of plenty of food for daily application and mindful engagement. So I'm going to move to the next element, right action, concerning which the Buddha said, "And what is right action? Abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, abstaining from sexual misconduct. This is called right action." Now, let's take the three topics one at a time. Killing. Killing refers to intentionally taking the life of any sentient being, commonly understood to include human beings, animals, birds, and in some cases insects. The concept of killing is expanded in Buddhist teaching to include not only the taking of physical life, but any form of torture, or even intentionally harming a sentient being in some way. Buddhist practices aim at helping us cultivate a right resolve in this area by probing and scrutinizing ways that our actions and our speech are forms of killing or harming in subtle ways because of our intentions, which can be, again, very subtle. It requires a certain brutal honesty with ourselves to be able to say truthfully whether we intended harm or not in specific cases. What about theft? Theft is defined as taking something not voluntarily offered to us by the owner, whether we do so openly or secretly or by force or by fraud. And again, both the intention and the act itself matter. So let's face the fact that we have views about what is private versus public property, and thus what constitutes ownership of something, and thus what theft would be. Our views, as we've reminded ourselves a little earlier, are bundles of things which result in ideas that are not necessarily purely objectively true. Right action relative to theft forces us to examine our views on property, requiring right view. Right resolve is required in order to become aware of the subtle and often subconscious operations of our intentions with respect to objects and our use of them. Let's make up an example in this case to try to make it concrete. So let's say that a colored marker was purchased by a mother as part of a packet of say 20 different markers with different colors. The mother brings them home. One child asks to use a marker, and after drawing for a bit at the table, goes to use the restroom. The other child picks it up to use it. The first child returns, and a whole scene takes place. That's mine. You took it. But whose property is the marker? Did the second child intend to steal it? That's a simplistic example, but it surfaces some of the ways that right view and right resolve are important in right action, and we could apply them to all sorts of things. And there are bigger issues than colored markers. So let's look at some. What about ownership of land? A body of water, airspace, air itself? In our day, intellectual property, especially because of AI, is getting more and more complicated and relevant. And our views and our intentions and our actions about land and water and air and knowledge and intellectual property all have very real practical consequences. In order to just kind of zero in on some things, I'm going to use a very personal example relative to AI in this case, but I think it will surface issues that could apply to anything. It's something that I'm keenly aware of because I'm a small-time do-it-yourself singer-songwriter, and some of what I create I produce myself, meaning I don't go to someone else's studio. I do the projects in such a way that I am doing all the vocals, lead and backup. I play all the instruments, guitars, bass, piano, harmonica. And for rhythm and percussion, I like to use sometimes household objects in place of drums and shakers and cymbals, or sometimes to use settings on my keyboard to create those sounds, which I then perform and record as I play. In the past, I've used loops provided by the recording software I use to create percussion on my tracks, but I really prefer to do it myself. Now, there's an increasing use of AI among musicians and products that a musician can use to create arrangements of songs. I could, for example, get a piece of software provided by one of these companies, write a song, record myself singing it and playing my guitar, and then, using the right prompts, I could have AI add instruments and backing vocals, including replacing my own guitar playing and my voice with other versions of that, and thus, quote-unquote, create a finished piece for release. I can even, with some products, provide prompts for the sort of lyrics I want, and I can have AI write or finish the words. In fact, some companies advertise their products by saying to potential customers, in effect, you don't need to be able to play an instrument, or know music, or write lyrics, or be able to sing, or come up with your own melody in order to write and record and release a song. Just give our tool the right prompts, and voila, release your creativity. Now, I find that last statement more than a little ironic, and it begs questions about the right view, quote-unquote, of creativity. But here's my main point about theft and right action. The companies producing such tools train their AI products by drawing on music created by real musicians, their voices, their instrumental work, their lyrics, their melodies. And what they offer in response to a so-called creator's so-called prompts pulls from the truly creative work of real human songwriters, singers, and instrumentalists. And so related to property and theft and right action, if I use such a tool to create a song, whose property is it really? Whose song have I created? Did the company whose software I pay to use, software that trains on the work of other artists that were not paid when the software was trained by their work, commit theft? Have I committed theft myself if I pay that company and, in a sense, empower them and their theft? In my case, I have a view, quote-unquote, which I think is a right view and not just a bundle of unexamined views, namely that the music being used to train AI does not belong to those companies in question, and that they are using the property of real musicians without consent, which is at the heart of the Buddha's definition of theft. I've also made what I understand to be a right resolve in my case, namely that I will never use AI in the creation of my music or poetry in any way. My resolve is in part based on what I understand a right view is relative to theft. But to be honest, it's also based on my own aesthetics and a preference for music that feels authentic and sort of imperfect, which is defined, I admit, in my own idiosyncratic sense of taste. But let me make it even more complicated and set aside AI for a moment. Some I know who use such products in their music have pushed back on my viewpoint by saying that using AI trained by the work of others is actually no different than when a musician, such as myself, subconsciously pulls from all the music I've ever heard in my life when I write a so-called original song. Every composer or songwriter has sounds and melodies and lyrical combinations and instrumental solos, etc., stored up in our memory banks when we're creating. And the same is true for a novelist or a filmmaker, and for fields of human endeavor outside of the arts as well. You could say that our brains have been trained on the music of others in ways not altogether different from what I have criticized with AI. So when have we infringed on someone else's property? When have we stolen it? I'll be honest here. I'm actually not sure yet how to answer that in detail, other than with an admission that at some deep intuitive level, it just feels different with the AI-trained software than with a human artist who's been influenced by other human artists, knowingly and unknowingly. I recognize that my quote-unquote view is also a bundle. It's dependent on all sorts of other things, and not necessarily a purely objective 100% right view. The whole question of what constitutes theft is complicated. It's subtle. But it's also a very present reality, and right resolve relative to one's intentions is absolutely necessary. Right view relative to what property is and whether something is private or public domain is necessary. And in addition, so is right view in terms of how all of this use of the property that we might be using is fueled by craving. Craving for success, craving for attention, and thus connecting us to suffering. I'm going to have to leave it there for now and move on to the third example of right action in the Buddhist teaching, and it has to do with sex. The teaching of the Buddha relative to right action as it applies to sex has an application for monks and an application for non-monks. For Buddhist monks, those who've left the household life, including marriage, right action requires very strict celibacy, including abstaining from sexual activity in every imaginable expression. I won't be too explicit other than simply saying that this includes, for example, pleasuring oneself. Right action for Buddhists who are not monks prohibits any sexual involvement with someone unmarried or married, and specifically lists those who might be protected by parents or relatives. It's a cultural way, I think, of referring to what we would call someone underage. There's also a specific prohibition relative to sex with convicts, which suggests to me, both of these, that the Buddha's very aware in his day and age of the fact that human beings, and men in particular, take advantage of power dynamics in relation to sex. The role of men is a power dynamic. Age is a power dynamic. Employment and ownership is a power dynamic. Someone being incarcerated and under the control of another person is a power dynamic. So I think the Buddha was aware of these things. And it suggests as well a much broader application of this particular prohibition then, I think, than simply literally, say, convicts. Work subordinates, people in debt, people whose reputations or careers or livelihood might be in the control of others, people in desperate circumstances, and so on. Any situation involving some form of power dynamic, I think, would fall under this prohibition. Cultivating a right view of what constitutes right action relative to sex is implicit in all of the above, but it's extremely important to apply it in our day and age. For example, much of the Buddha's instruction assumed certain definitions of marriage, definitions which are very different or which are being redefined in many ways today. And the same is true of gender and sexuality, and thus of sexual expression and action. So what's a right view of all of this now? I don't think it's right for me to prognosticate about how the Buddha would view our current understandings, and these are hotly debated understandings of marriage and gender and sexuality. It's a complicated conversation that every religious heritage and philosophical tradition is navigating. It's a conversation in psychology and in science. I've done extensive work of my own in terms of my interpretations of these issues relative to the Christian heritage that's in my background. But I'm not in any position to give opinions on behalf of the Buddha or Buddhism on this. I'm going to, therefore, personalize this conversation by sharing my own way of trying to understand how I approach right action relative to sex on these issues. I am, for example, an affirming ally. I believe that cultivating right view and right resolve is absolutely critical for right action in the arena of our humanness involving gender and sexuality in lots of different expressions. My own view, as I try to apply right view here, is that there is a wide range of gender identity and sexual expression. And so I don't begin by listing specific expressions in my mind that I think are incorrect or prohibited. Instead, because I'm aware that there are unhealthy, abusive, broken dimensions in every variety of our gendered and sexual humanness, including in my own, I focus instead on questions of intention and attachment and authenticity. Let me explain that a little further. While I don't presume to speak for what the Buddha's opinions on all this would be, were he to be living and teaching in the 21st century, I do feel confident in saying that he would say that each of us are responsible to cultivate right action relative to gender and sexuality in ways shaped by right view and right resolve, and by the self-awareness that other elements in the path will bring to bear. And as examples from my approach to this, let me just share these. Relative to right resolve, I think in the form, the application of this in the form of our intentions and our motivations in the expression of our wishes for and the fulfillment of those wishes for sexual intimacy. Right resolve is extremely important in really identifying those things. Right view in terms of an honest awareness of our own healthy attachments and our unhealthy attachments, forms of craving that result in suffering as distinguished from natural and legitimate sexual desire. Sexual addictions, for example, come into play here. And in terms of honest appraisals of how our views are shaped by a complex bundle of factors. So those are just some examples of how I think Buddhist teaching might apply in these areas from my approach. But I need to mention something here as well before we move on to the next topic. It's clear that there's a common element in the Buddhist teaching that there are things to cease and things to replace them with. Remember, for example, again, the three poisons of craving, anger, and illusion, to be replaced with detachment, compassion, and direct knowing of things as they are. So what might be the equivalent of this in Buddhist teaching relative to sex? And let me just give some things I've come across in my research here as to different ways that Buddhist teaching and Buddhists currently are approaching this or have approached this. First, there isn't just one single thing called Buddhism. There are multiple Buddhisms, and one of those Buddhisms is Tantric Buddhism. And in that tradition, sexual energy and expression is a means of spiritual awakening, or can be aimed in that direction. Sexual desire can be a channel for wisdom and bliss. Now, I'm not here referring to some of the popularized, westernized versions of Tantric wisdom, which can really devolve into some really unhealthy things. And I think Buddhists would see that and name that. I'm referring to the expressions of Tantric Buddhist wisdom in this area, grounded in the depths of real Buddhist tradition. Second, among some Buddhist teachers, there is an approach to right action and sex that encourages fostering sexual intimacy as a means to cultivate love, kindness, and emotional connection. And again, right view would be, and right resolve, right intention become really, really crucial here. Self-awareness and honesty. And in both cases, there's a third emphasis that can be found. Both of those two examples, Tantric wisdom and this emphasis that I just mentioned among some Buddhist teachers, both assume the importance of mindfulness in the expression of sexuality, which would involve experiencing sex with a deeper awareness of ourselves, our partners, and the full range of what we're actually feeling and sensing and aware of in the moment during sexual intimacy itself. Now, I'm going to need to conclude my overview of right action related to killing and harm, theft and property, and expressions of sexuality, and move to the next of the three morality elements. But in each case so far, it seemed fitting to try to address ways that these aspects of the Buddha's path might address very contemporary issues related to social media, as one example, AI as another that I gave, and this conversation about gender and sexuality. So now to that third final element of the Eightfold Path that is included in the morality basket, the three that are in that basket. So we've looked at right speech and right action, and we turn now to right livelihood. Relative to monks, the instructions about right livelihood are pretty straightforward. Monks were to live exclusively by begging. They were further instructed that gaining their necessities in this way didn't mean that they should just accept everything that was offered to them. They were only to accept, and also only to keep and possess, whatever was strictly necessary for livelihood. Relative to those of us who are not monks, there is a sutta called the Vanijja Sutta, and the Buddha said in that teaching that non-monks should, quote-unquote, not engage in 5 types of business. Which 5? Business in weapons, business in human beings, business in meat, business in intoxicants, business in poison. These are the 5 types of business that a lay follower should not engage in. Each of the 5 has 2 aspects. First, there's what each actually means, and then there's the question of what it means to engage in them. First, what are the 5 prohibited means of livelihood, and how might we give them a little more definition? The business of weapons includes making, selling, distributing, marketing, and of course purchasing them. The business of human beings includes slavery, prostitution, trafficking, and would be extended to any business that exploits or uses people. The business of meat includes the actual butchering but also raising of animals for slaughter, or say owning a store that includes the sale of meat. Business in intoxicants includes alcohol, marijuana, mushrooms, legal and illegal mind-altering or addictive drugs. Business in poisons, of course, involves any type of enterprise that manufactures, sells, or otherwise benefits from chemicals or other products harmful to health and life, including the health and life of the environment. Now, what does it mean to engage in these? We need to remember that the Buddha's teaching on these took place within a culture in which transactions and businesses were typically undertaken at a very micro, village, personal, direct level. So for the Buddha, it would have meant quite directly buying, selling, making, butchering, etc., and it would have been easy to know who was doing it. But this gets much more complicated in our day. So here's some considerations along the way, just the things that have sort of come to me as I have reflected on this. What if I work at a distillery as, say, a janitor? What if my investment portfolio includes tobacco companies? Am I engaged in the business of intoxicating substances? What if I work in a company, let's leave alone for the moment, let's just set aside really direct abusive practices and businesses, quote unquote, such as prostitution and trafficking and slavery. What if I work in a company that is rampant with overt and subtle forms of human abuse or oppression or oppressive practices or whatever it may be in terms of how they pay, how they reward, etc.? Am I engaged in the business of human beings at that point? What if I purchase groceries at a store that includes a meat section? Or if I purchase non-meat items from a company that sells meat? Am I engaged in the business of butchering? What about paying taxes when I know my government uses the money for weapons? What about joining the armed forces? Am I engaged in the weapons business? Cars emit poisonous material into the air. Leaving aside private transportation for a moment, what if I own or work within a company that profits from the automobile industry, such as auto manufacturing, a transportation company, a bus line, a car rental business, even car repair? What about buying bottled water when I know that plastic poisons the environment? Or a much more recent and very relevant question, what if I use AI for any purpose at all when I know that the data centers on which AI depends use massive amounts of precious water and add a huge footprint in terms of warming the environment, not to mention the impact of the vast amounts of land required? Am I engaged in poison? I know that these are questions that Buddhists are also asking. In preparing for this episode, I was very interested in this whole question of right livelihood because of how practical and yet complicated it is in today's world. My research suggests that one of the major ways that Buddhists are encouraged to navigate these issues is to focus on the application of right resolve, and especially the cultivation of mindfulness related to one's motivations, and the cultivation of compassion and the intention of benefiting others, the cultivation of the intention to do no harm, as sort of broad approaches that would apply to all of these. Right view applied here would encourage us to cultivate an honest appraisal as to whether any of our direct or indirect ways of engaging with the 5 forbidden livelihoods flows from the craving that leads to suffering or incites that craving in others. Now, that's probably obvious relative to, say, intoxicants, but this element can also be as subtle as examining whether my enjoyment of just sheer convenience and the avoidance of inconvenience affects my shopping or transportation choices in ways that contribute unnecessarily to poisoning the environment, for example. There are many similar examples that we could surface here. But I'm going to start concluding and summarizing. We've been digging into the second main division of the elements of the Eightfold Path, the morality basket. And in the process, we've seen a number of ways that right view and right resolve from the wisdom basket that we had looked at previously are essential to right speech, right action, and right livelihood in this morality basket. These 5 elements that we've looked at so far are interdependent, and they serve to sustain one another. In fact, we could move from right livelihood back to right action, and right action to right livelihood, and cross-pollinate, as it were, and right speech in the same way. But these 5 elements all are interdependent and serve to sustain and inform one another. While we looked in detail at all of this, in the process of wrapping up the episode, I think it is also possible to summarize things under a fairly broad umbrella. The wisdom of right view and right resolve, when applied to the morality of right speech, action, and livelihood, will cause me to seek to do no harm to any sentient being in any way, and to foster speech, action, and means of living which serve to benefit the good of others as an expression of compassion. I think that's a fairly thorough way to try to summarize this basket of speech, action, and livelihood. Our explorations also serve to highlight, once again, the essentially practical interests of the Buddha. He was certainly a profound philosopher, and he practiced and encouraged a life devoted to mindful meditation and mental absorption or contemplation, and his monks withdrew from normal routines of life in order to pursue those things with more intentionality and intensity. However, his teaching is clearly aimed at giving detailed instruction for speech and action and the provision for our life for those of us who live in the so-called real world. The next of the 3 divisions in the Eightfold Path is the meditation basket, and that includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Those 3 will prove to be even more complex and require more explanation than anything we've yet encountered, and we'll begin to explore them next time.